Bonjour et bienvenue à nos
Hello and
diplômés,
welcome to all
membres
our
de la
participants
communauté
today,
étudiante, membres de la faculté
alumni,
et
students,
à des
faculty
nouveaux et
members,
vieux amis à
and
travers le
old and
monde.
new friends throughout the world.
Hello and welcome to all our participants today, alumni, students, faculty members, and new and old friends from around the world. Bonjour,
Hello,
je m'appelle
my name is Victoria
Victoria Bahram et
Bahram,
je suis la
and I'm
doyenne
the
de la
Dean of the
faculté des
Faculty
sciences
of
sociales
Social Sciences
ici à
here at the
l'Université
University of
d'Ottawa.
Ottawa.
Je suis
I'm
très
very
heureuse de
pleased
vous
to
accueillir
welcome you
à
to
cette
this
cinquième
fifth
édition
edition
de la
of the
série
Singh
de
Family
conférences de la famille Singh.
Distinguished Lecture Series.
En préambule, nous
First,
souhaitons rendre
we pay
hommage au
respect
peuple
to
algonquin,
the Algonquin people,
gardien
who are the
traditionnel de
traditional
cette terre.
guardians of this land.
Nous reconnaissons
We
les
acknowledge
liens
their
sacrés de
long-standing
longue date,
relationship with this
l'unisson de ce
territory, which
territoire
remains
qui
unceded.
demeure non cédé. Nous rendons
We pay
également
respect
hommage
also
à tous les
to
peuples
all
autochtones
Indigenous people
qui habitent
in
au
this
Canada,
region,
qu'ils soient de la
from
région
all nations
ou
across
d'ailleurs,
Canada
d'Ottawa.
or
Nous
who are from Ottawa.
reconnaissons les gardiens des
We
savoirs
acknowledge the traditional
traditionnels,
knowledge keepers,
jeunes
both
et
young
âgés.
and old,
Nous honorons
and we honor
aussi
their
leur courageux
courageous
dirigeants
leaders, past,
d'aujourd'hui et de
present,
demain.
and future.
Nous tenons
We would
aussi
also
à
like to
remercier
sincerely
sincèrement
thank
la famille
the
Singh
Singh family
pour leur
for their
générosité et
continued
leur
generosity and,
confiance
and
depuis le
trust
lancement de
since
cette
the
série
launch
de
of this lecture
conférences
series
en
in
2017,
2017,
qui a pour but
which
de
aims to
rassembler
bring
sur
the
le
world's
campus
leading
les
scholars,
différents érudits, chefs de file,
leaders, entrepreneurs,
entrepreneurs et
and public
enseignants
officials
du
to
monde
our
entier.
campus.
Diplômé de la faculté des sciences
Sean Singh
sociales en sciences
is
politiques
originally
et
from Ottawa
sociologie
and graduated in
en
1998 from the Faculty of
1998.
Social Sciences in
Sean Singh
Political
est
Science and Sociology
pro-rivière
here at the
d'Ottawa.
University of Ottawa.
Il est aujourd'hui
He
le
is now
conseiller général,
General
chef de
Counsel,
la
Chief
conformité
Compliance
et directeur
Officer, and
général de
Executive
Luminance
Director of
Management
Luminous
à New
Management
York.
in New York.
Il est aussi
He is also a
réalisateur de
film
films,
producer,
entrepreneur,
entrepreneur,
bénévole et
volunteer, and
philanthrope.
philanthropist.
Aujourd'hui, nous avons
Today,
l'honneur
we are honored to
d'accueillir
welcome a very
une
special
femme
guest,
à
a
la
woman who
carrière
is
et
who
aux
has
missions
an astounding
extraordinaires,
career and career path.
Christiane
Miss
Taubira. Madame
Christiane
la
Taubira.
ministre, bienvenue
Madam
et
Minister,
merci
allow me to
d'avoir
briefly introduce
accepté
you.
d'être présente parmi nous.
Thank you for being with us today.
Madame la ministre,
Madam
permettez-moi de vous
Minister, allow me to
présenter
briefly introduce you
succinctement pour celles
for
et
those
ceux qui
of
ne
you
vous
who don't
connaissent
know
pas
you
encore.
yet.
Vous êtes une femme
Christiane
politique
Taubira, you are a
conservatrice de
left-wing
gauche,
French politician
originaire de
from
Cayenne,
Cayenne,
en Guyane,
Guyana,
professeur de sciences
professor of
économiques,
economics,
toujours une bonne fois,
always a good choice,
titulaire
and
d'une licence
holder
en
of a
sociologie
degree in
et d'un
sociology, as
certificat
well as a
en
certificate in
ethnologie
African American
afro-américaine.
ethnology.
Votre
You
implication
began
en
your political
politique
involvement
démarre
as a pro-independence
mi-1890
activist
à la fin
in
des
the late
années 70.
1970s.
Par la suite, vous avez été
Afterwards, you then
député de
went to
l'Est
serve
Guyane
on as a
pendant
member of
plus de
parliament
20
for
ans.
Guyana for more than
C'est
20
au cours de
years.
ce mandat
And
que
it's
vous
during this mandate
proposez
that
la
you
loi
passed a law to
tendant à la
recognize
reconnaissance de la
the
traite et
slave
de
trade and
l'esclavage
slavery
en tant que
as a crime
crime de
against
de la
humanity.
traite et de l'esclavage en tant que crime contre l'humanité. Puis, sous la
After,
présidence de
under the
François
presidency of
Hollande,
François Hollande,
vous êtes nommé
you were
garde
appointed
des
Keeper of
Sceaux,
Seals
ministre
and
de la
Minister of
Justice
Justice
en
in
2012. En
2012. In
2013, vous soumettiez le
2013,
projet
you
de
passed
loi
a bill
favorisant le
recognizing
mariage pour couple de
same-sex marriage.
personnes de même sexe. Je remercie notre
I would also
modérateur
like to
pour
extend
ses
my
entretiens
gratitude to our
Abdoulaye
moderator,
Gay.
Mr. Abdullah Gay.
Abdoulaye Gay est professeur de
He is a
sociologie à
professor of
l'Université
sociology at the
d'Ottawa.
University of Ottawa.
Il est l'auteur
He has
co-auteur
authored and
de plusieurs
co-authored several
publications.
publications.
Son récent livre
His
de
recent
fiction
book of
s'intitule
fiction is called
Oublier la mère
Forget the
patrie.
Bitter Homeland.
Abdoulaye Gay est également le
He is also
co-éditeur de plusieurs
co-editor
livres,
of
dont
several books,
A Stain
including
on Our
A Stain
Past,
on Our Past,
Slavery and
Slavery and
Memory,
Memory,
Figures et
Figures and
expériences
Diasporic
diasporiques
Experiences,
et figures
and
postérieures
Encounters
de
between
l'histoire,
Intellectual Figures,
trajectoire,
Trajectories, Modes of
modalité,
Action,
production.
and Productions.
Ces articles
His
sont
articles were
apparus
published
dans
in a
plusieurs
number of
revues
international
internationales,
journals,
lors
including
desquelles The Dubois
the
Review,
Dubois Review,
Comparative
Comparative
Studies
Studies
of
of
South
Asia,
Asia,
of South
Africa
Asia,
and the Middle
Africa
East,
and the Middle
and
East,
French
and
Cultural
French Cultural
Studies.
Studies.
Le professeur Gay a reçu
Professor Gay
plusieurs
has
bourses,
received several
dont la
scholarships,
bourse de
including the
résidence de
residency scholarship of Dubois Institute Residency Fellowship from the Harvard University, the Institute for Advanced Study Residency Fellowship from Princeton University in 2015, and the foundation of the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in 2016. Before giving the floor to Professor Gay, I would like to invite you to write your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. I wish you, Madam Minister, Professor Gay, and all of you a wonderful conference. Ladies and gentlemen, hello. I'm very happy today to present you Christiane Taubira, former Justice Minister of the French Republic and author of a famous law that acknowledges slavery as a crime against humanity. The event is the commemoration of the 21st anniversary of the Taubira law. I'm also happy to present Ms. Taubira because of her singularity. She's one of the strongest political figures of her time. She is an example of the rare men and women who fought for human rights. Unique characters. Comparing her origins and her realizations, and also including her intellect, is quite representative. Where she studied and the identity and racial identity are key factors to ensure success. Ms. Taubira comes from the other side of the world, where she broke ground and fought for rights. She made sure that women had equal rights, regardless of their origins. For example, in Camelot films, we see biases, and that's where in Luxembourg, for example, we see rooms that are that look like libraries, and these people study there, waiting for their children to have access to education. So all this to say is that she has led a great mission in the French Republic. For her, existence is a relentless fight. Children never receive actually what from their parents genetically what they actually deserve. So this character was which is Ms. Taubira, was raised on the border of Bolivia. She witnessed very difficult moments in her life, but she knew great success in her scholarity. Then she went on to study in Paris and then returned to Guyane to apply the knowledge she acquired. In 1993, she became a deputy of the government. So in 2002, that's when she presented herself as a candidate for elections. For the first time in history, the French were able to elect someone of color, and the electorship see in her hope. However, her political agenda were led by noble principles of the Republic. 2002 is preceded by other events. They are witnessing the anniversary of abolishment of slavery. It's certain that it is an initiative that is important, but her actions justify that the Republic go further in its abolishment against crime against slavery as a crime against humanity. She fought for equality. In a country where we made the Republic, the emancipation of Black slaves By going to the Capitol, she was able to accomplish great things. The French Parliament adopted the Taubira law. By called she also fought for recognizing the same-sex marriage in a bill that she passed in 2013. In May 2013, the law, Taubira law was passed. So here are two quite great accomplishments that Ms. Taubira had under her belt. Madame Taubira brought forth several bills that were able to recognize certain rights. And it was the opportunity for her to use conflictual moments and to bring them forth by entrenching them in laws. We are honored today to have Madame Taubira among us. On behalf of the University of Ottawa, I would also like to welcome you and thank all the students who are here, without which the organization of this event would not be possible. Karen Cohen-Sanchez, Cassie Drodge, and Alexandra Karabastos are all University of Ottawa students. And on our behalf, Christelle da Silva, Amand Degla are from the School of Economics in Benin. Thank you so much, and please join me in welcoming Madame Taubira. Thank you, Victoria Bahram, Dean, for your welcoming words, the presentation of the conference and its cycle that allows the sharing of knowledge and allowing opportunities to break barriers and have different conference speakers. Thank you so much for this welcome. Thank you, Professor Abdoulaye, for this very deep portrait of my career. And it is a career path, very personal, that has led me to question different things in society. For example, in France, its own discourse and values. We will now spend 1.5 hours together, and later I will talk to you again. I think I have about 15 minutes to speak about this conference, whether to remember the very painful memories and remembering equalities. These are themes that were proposed by the University of Ottawa in this cycle of conferences. I have started questioning the words and the theme of this topic. So during these 15 minutes, I will pinpoint my points, and then we will have a discussion on this, and then I will then discuss with students about their different questions that they will have for me. And they have been actually selected on different proposals and themes. So on this theme, remembering difficult and painful memories and recognizing differences, for example, questioning the thematic itself, what pertains to words, memory, and painful. So the first question that I'm asking myself, because we're starting off from questions that are being asked by students, so students who daily explore wording and their meaning. So painful memory, the first question that I would like, and reflection I would like everybody to think about, is why? Why do we say painful memory? First of all, we know who we're talking about. So there is a reference, a consensual reference. When we talk about painful memories, we think about visible and non-visible minorities. We think about marginalized minorities, vulnerable communities without the ability to act. And I think it is quite terrifying. I think that this reference needs to appeal to us and lead us to make change and to start using the right words where the implicit thematics are quite problematic. For example, when we talk about the winners in a war, we also think about these same categories of people. And why do we think that these peoples um, were assimilated is because they also lead us to think about the terror and the pain that they had to go through historically. So throughout history and through its dynamics, we realize that those who we call who were conquered are actually conquering, whether they are captive people who were captive against their will and reduced to slavery. I also speak about people who also went through slavery on their own territory. In both meanings of the word, these are conflicts that went through time, and these people withstood the physical, mental, and psychological pain. These people fought, or whether by resisting and by staying alive, they were able to resist in time and go beyond these difficult periods. They are winners not only from this standpoint, but also from the standpoint of great human ideals. They were able to prove daily of the inability of humans to be reduced to nothing. So certain concepts seem to contain a different context and implicit context. This is my first reasoning. Then, speaking about the painful memory that needs to be restored, what does this actually mean? This is a this has several meanings. Is it reestablishing, repairing, or rehabilitating? What? The memory, the pain, and contestably, we will come back to this in our discussions. So what I would like to ask you, the young generation, to eliminate the the painful burden, but to discredit it, not only to discredit it, but to be able to neutralize the effects on us, but mostly to allow it to emerge in a fruitful way to make us stronger. When these peoples were lived through violences, they were able to resist that. They were able to go beyond and still continue to live. They were able to exteriorize their pain through songs, through crying, through different ways. So we need to get rid of this burden because of their ability to combat these difficult moments. They came out stronger. They were treated as objects and furniture as property of their masters and as cattle. In the gratitude of these people, we need to eliminate this burden. Of course, we need to recognize it, but we need to refuse that the identity is based on reducing us to sufferance and to pain. We need to rehabilitate the memory and pain or painful memories by doing it with dignity that make us worthy of those who are around us. Second, recognizing differences. There are several meanings in terms of recognizing it. Is it simply observing? Is it simply understanding it? Or rather, shall we admit the presence and rights of those who I mentioned earlier, that automatically we know who we refer to? What is it actually? Recognizing, of course, all the previously mentioned notions, but we will also come back to this. So let's go on speaking about differences. What do our differences mean? The possessive pronoun us, our. So usually words don't have biases, but however, the difference is the rule. So differences is something natural of the human condition. Our differences, why our differences? Our differences referring to what? To a standard, and which standard? This is a question that we need to have and we need to talk about together. So these differences, we need to look at them as the underlying principle of the human condition, the singularity, identity, but not in the fear of a group who succumbs to panic, but identity in what history is about, who we are, and what our relationship is with the world, the choice of our identities, the cultural background that we have, and the way we identify with the different heritage, and what we accepted to take in and to integrate. So in this identity, there is place for collective memory, but also for memory of the oneness. So we bear this burden together. We try to survive, and we try also to keep on going with the sufferance that appeals to us. But there's also the more global collective memory, because fundamentally it's simply the history of humanity. It is a collective history. It's not the history of a community, of a minority. It is, in the end, the history of humanity. And we will go in detail about this a little bit later. So by recognizing our differences, meaning recognizing and acknowledging that the human species is, on one hand, the same and diverse and unified and multiple, but whoever we are, regardless of our career paths, of what we look like, and our cultural background, we belong to this human species, and we keep on going, and we bear the history within us and our abilities to act in the future. So these questions will allow us to think about the automatic use of certain words that bear certain meanings and biases. So memory is related to the fact that events did take place, and the relationship between memory and history is quite a direct relationship. They can't go one without the other. There are certain historians and people who have access to archives who look at documents, but they look at the different environments and territories and historical artifacts, and then the memory is then carried out by activists into action. Sometimes the historical artifacts that we have are quite of poor quality. So activists, what they do is that they produce action, interaction, and bringing about their actions. So social militants give youth to these very old concepts, and then they bring them forth to bring them about in the common society. On the other hand, the work that historians do is that they verbalize the historical backgrounds and literature that we have and bring it back to life. So, for example, artists, intellectuals, writers, philosophers, and others that don't necessarily appreciate that I put them in the category of artists, artists themselves of all types of expressions, poetry, writers, whether they are painters or other. So all these artists are the pillars that will lead politicians to hear about different political issues and to decide on them in the general interest. So there's dialectic relationship and the historical workings that allow us to question history. I wanted to give a couple of examples, but I will give them at the right moment in the discussion so that I don't waste the few minutes that I have to talk to you about right now. So talking about these very painful memories that they cannot be kept inside us as a burden, but it is part of humanity. We should look at it rather as richness. And the history of the world allow us to recognize these differences and give us the result that we have today. If societies are plural, are the result of the colonialist conquests. In the United States, for example, what they are is a representative of a result of the genocide of indigenous peoples and as a result of the slavery and slave trade and the ongoing immigration process. So if South America has a mixture of indigenous people and then this population doesn't have access to the political apparatus, so domination is also a result of humanity. This is the history of the world, is the history of at least 3 continents, and adding the Asian continent without difficulty. This history makes our society that we see today very plural. And because it's plural, we need to acknowledge the issue of differences and singularities as well as alterity. So as with painful memories and in the concept of the conquered, there's also a trap. And that trap is that knowing the other and recognizing and acknowledging the other and wanting to know more about the other, and on the other side is the prefabricated image that we project on others. So at the time of this, when slavery was taking place, there was a prefabricated image of people outside of their reality in order to make ourselves feel better and justify their dominating position.
So this seeks to give someone else a whole bunch of stereotypes that would define us based on a phenotype that you were talking about earlier. That person is a liar, they steal, they're a criminal, etc. So that then becomes equations for a whole series of negative situations. So if we ask ourselves on painful memories and on differences, well, it's based on our relationship with humanity, with the world, and our awareness of our presence in the world, and all of these questions that great authors like François Fanon, Edouard Glissant, and many others have talked about. And they examined this, and they have proposed to us to ask and more about this. And so I'm going to conclude by talking about the relationship between memory and history with powerful words from Mr. Baldwin, James Baldwin. History is not the past. History is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history.
And if we say otherwise,
if we present this in any other way, we literally were our criminals. And then he adds to that, I do attest this. The world is not white.
It never was white.
It never was white.
Cannot be white.
It cannot be white.
White is a metaphor.
White is a metaphor for power.
And that is simply
a way to describe Chismadatan Bak. Yes, so this is direct because it's Baldwin, and he wrote this in the 60s, and that's why he uses the metaphor of a metaphor. But it is obvious that that in the end of
Par
the
exemple, il
year
aurait pu prendre comme
2000s,
métaphore la Lehman
we may have
Brothers.
used a different metaphor.
S'il écrivait aujourd'hui,
But
il
if
aurait
this was
choisi
written
une
today,
autre
maybe he
métaphore
would use
très
another
forte.
metaphor
Il de
for that
même que
metaphor.
ce qu'il dit est exact. Et ceux qui parfois se laissent aller
And then
pour des
sometimes
problèmes
people
de
who
couleur
get mixed up
doivent
in
entendre
the issues of
cela.
colors need to
Une
hear this.
métaphore
They
pour
need to
les
hear
autres.
about
Et
this
donc la
metaphor for
question
power. So
centrale
here is the
de
central
notre
question,
rapport à la
is that
mémoire, de notre
our
rapport à
relationship with memory
l'histoire,
and with
il y a la
history,
question
we
de
also have
notre
to think
rapport au
about our
pouvoir,
relationship to
il y a la
power
question des
and
idéaux qu'on tient,
ideals,
il y a la question de notre
and the
conception
question of
de la
our
société,
concept of
il y a la question
society.
de l'altérité,
There's the
il y a la
question
question
of
de
the otherness,
fraternité, il y a la
brotherhood,
question de notre
and
regard
we
sur
also
le
have to
monde,
question our look on the
la
world, our
question de
outlook on the
notre
world.
regard sur
These,
le monde. Et indépendamment de nos
and
couleurs de peau,
whatever the
c'est
color of our
autour de
skin,
nos
it is
idéaux
based on our
que nous
ideals
pouvons
that
décider
we
et
can
choisir
decide and
ensemble
choose
de
together
bâtir le monde.
how to
Merci.
move forward together. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Minister. I think what we can do right now, move to the next point after this introduction. So the question and answers, or this discussion. We have a series of questions that we would have liked to have gone through with you, but we don't have much time and it's very precious. So we won't have the opportunity to ask all the questions we had in mind. But firstly, I'd like to open this discussion and to take on what you were mentioning in your talking about. Yes, painful memories. Oftentimes we refer to certain people from African descent or Native American, and this invites us to look at this equation before between pain and memory. We also know that memory is a part of building our identity. We build this identity through memory, and identity is about relationship, because all identities is about defining ourselves, but also based on or in opposition to something else, someone else. And beyond this, the relationship between the Black people and in Europe, as we know, is very violent. Pain was at the center of this relationship, but the question is, what happens if African descendants take abstraction and use only that to build an identity? So is it possible? I should ask you that. Well, I don't think we should remove pain and look at that alone. It is not about saying that there is no pain. No. I don't think, though, that you can separate pain. What I'm saying is that we can't let ourselves be governed by pain. We have to get rid of this burden. And when I say that, I mean that let's not be governed by pain. Otherwise, we are defeated and not defeaters. And we are defeaters for humanity. Because if these people fought and resisted and they preserved their humanity, even though they were treated like objects, like animals, these people were able to maintain their humanity. And they have done great things for humanity. I think about jazz, I think about all of the other music that is a part of jazz, and I can think of the explanation of the cosmos and the world. I think about the oral tradition and all of this past with legends. These are things that explain the world, that talk about relationships amongst people. I think about mythology, thing that is transmitted. And I think about all of these traditions and all of these understanding and the virtue of the knowledge of plants, knowledge of nature, be it mountains, earth, the sea. And I think about all of these things. I think about gastronomy and how to use these foods, those foods, and certain protein that is found in nature and how to heal oneself. So all of this is a past that was passed down by these people. So it is in the name of humanity that I say that we shouldn't let ourselves be squashed by pain. Yes, there was a lot of pain, and throughout my life, I have been persuaded that I have dealt with all of my past, but then sometimes I do cry. I just break down. So suffering is part of us because and we know it's very painful. You can't become immune to all of this. But let's not let ourselves be governed by pain. And that is at that point that we would become useless and we would become unfaithful to those people who have directly experienced these crimes, people who lived this reality. That's what I mean by the necessity of, now, same thing with memory. Today, for example, people are able to take advantage of the past because over the 4 centuries of slavery and slave trade and colonization, this has accumulated capital, especially in Europe, not only in Europe, but especially, and it led to the emergence of industrial revolutions and the diversification, funding of research, science, and all of that. So it's not necessarily about, well, you wouldn't have been able to do that and you can't do that. But the fact is, the historic fact is that that happened because of that crime perpetrated for centuries. So there's no reason to be overcome by it with the pain. And then, then people are going to say, well, why don't you go cry somewhere else and, hide? No, no, no. It is all about our history, our past. In your introduction, you talked about the importance of the common good. If you could please elaborate on that, and as you know today, we face a resurgence in some sort of extremist movements and to define a certain homogeneity of a nation. And all of this seems to go against what you have said, so the creation of a common global good. So here's the question. What argument would you present to convince all of these people who don't agree, all of these political movements who call for the preservation of purity and homogeneity? Well, Professor, I am a woman of hard work. So I look at my presence in life and my utility in life through a vision of the world and of society, and through this vision of relationships amongst people and groups. So sincerely, I would say that this is the last of my worries, to convince racist or sexist people, homophobes. There are people who have prejudices because, of course, we can't always escape prejudices. When you look at, for example, European societies, France in particular, you see that there's a whole century of teaching and people were fed this information with prejudices, and they were injected in their minds and their understanding over generations that Black people were wild people, that they were cannibals, etc. So there are people who do have prejudices. So you can have prejudices and be open and want to learn and want to understand. In that case, I agree to dialogue and relationship. But people who have decided once and for all that they are above other people, that's their question, that's their problem. I am bringing together forces around ideals. And as I was saying before, I believe that humans are unique and diverse. I sincerely believe in that, and deeply. So what counts for me here is to work with these people. So what is our responsibility in the world? And what are we doing with this responsibility? So I am more concerned with what we need to give to our young generation and what we are going to, the heritage that we are going to leave to them. And obviously we want to help them so that they can restore the situation. So those who are on their own deserted island and they have their thoughts, look, I'm not a psychiatrist. If that's their problem, they should find someone else to deal with that. But people who have doubts and people who are trying to understand, look, there are many things to explain to them, many things to share with them. So when I talk about this idea, I am saying that we normally want to, our reflex is to bring our forces together. And we do understand that we have the burden of slavery and the denial of people's humanity. We have all of that in us. And people, we know that we have this history within us, and we are our history. We can't escape the fact that we are our history, but let's not get all caught up in it. And that's what Frantz Fanon says. I don't have the right to get myself bogged down in that. So we have this past, and we understand that through heritage, painful heritage, through this baggage, we know that it is not only a painful background. I know that women who were slaves also fell in love, and I know that they tried to seduce. And I like the idea that they had a way to walk in order to seduce the man that they chose, even if these men were reduced to slavery. I like the idea what love is all about. I like the idea that they knew how to sing to seduce. And I also love the idea that they knew exactly what they were doing when they were seducing the master. So it's not all about suffering. There are people who have survived so that we can be here today. And they didn't accept it to be reduced to that. So what we need to make sure we do is to carry this history together. Okay. Based on what you have just said, and we are talking about memory again and living together, something that we asked ourselves during this discussion that we had yesterday between my students and I, and what is the relationship that you establish on understanding and acknowledging these memories and social justice? How are these things linked in our battle? So let's talk about memory, and this is something that is very important for students and for those who have who are activists. I know that when I was a student, I was defending all causes when I was a student, and then I was able to focus on things at home. But when I was a student, I was really fighting against apartheid, supporting Palestinians, the reunification for certain people, and to support Algerians. Thinking about the massacres that occurred, massacres of 1961. So these are all the causes that drove me, and I felt involved in all of these causes. So what is important for youth is to understand that, look, it is delicate when it comes to memory. We know that people have been fighting for generations. Why aren't we able to reach that level? Well, this is just a thought for our discussion, and this should be able to help people give more information for those experts. But despite generations of battles, if we stay closed, it is because we believed ourselves that these were certain memories. Yes, we have made claims and demands
on a revendiqué,
for
voilà,
certain
des dates,
spaces,
des
for
lieux.
dates, for
Aujourd'hui, des
locations, and
statuts,
today
des noms de
statues,
rues et de
names
places.
of roads
On
and
a revendiqué,
squares, and we have
reconnaissez
claimed
notre
the
histoire,
fact that we need to recognize our history
reconnaissez vos
and to
crimes,
recognize the crimes that
reconnaissez,
occurred and
voilà,
to
reconnaissez tous les
recognize
crimes qui
all
ont
of
été
the
faits dans le
hurt
passé.
that has occurred in the
Mais
past.
moi, je
But
pense qu'il faut dépasser
we
ces
need to go
dialogues-là.
beyond that
Il y a des
dialogue.
périodes où
There was a
c'était
period where, yes,
nécessaire.
that was
Aujourd'hui,
necessary.
il faut que
But
la
today,
génération suivante,
the
elle
next generation
dépasse
needs
ce
to go
dialogue-là.
beyond that
C'est-à-dire que,
dialogue.
oh, attention, là,
So
on porte
you have to
ensemble
say,
notre
look,
histoire.
together we have this
On
common
porte
history.
ensemble notre histoire.
Together we have this
Et
history.
donc, si ça me fait davantage souffrir,
So
c'est parce
if it's
que
benefit,
mes ancêtres
if I
ont
suffer today,
été
well, it's because my
sous le
ancestors
joug
were
de
under
cette domination.
this domination.
Mais dans mes ancêtres, il y en a quand même deux ou trois
But there are some of
qui
my
viennent du
ancestors that
Caucase,
come from the Caucasus
dans les
Mountains,
régions
in that
caucasiennes.
area at least,
Parce que les viols,
because there was rape,
les viols, ça donne du
and
métissage
rape
depuis le décollage du bateau.
has led to mixing,
Les viols, ça donne ça à l'arrivée des enfants métis.
and it led to
Les
métis
viols sur les
children.
plantations,
There were
ça donne des
rapes
enfants
on
métis.
plantations.
Donc, nous qui venons de cette
So
histoire,
we
nous
come
sommes
from this
personnes
history,
soi-disant, nous portons foi,
and we
nous
carry
portons
this
ça.
history.
Donc, c'est bien tout le monde qui
So
contribue.
everybody is involved in that.
Et ce qu'il faut, c'est pas dire,
Should
nous
we say,
avons
well,
une mémoire
not,
particulière,
we shouldn't say that we have this memory, make way for it,
jours fériés dans
and
l'année,
give us some more days off in the year. Let's recognize 2 or 3 of our great leaders. No.
Et là, comment on porte l'histoire du
How do we
monde
carry
avec ces
the world's
empreintes
history
aujourd'hui
with
sur le monde
what exists today
et
in the
le
world?
calcanéum sur le dos des gratte-ciel et Césaire. Pas un coin de ce monde
There's not anywhere in the world
trace
that does not have my
calcanéum
trace.
sur le dos des gratte-ciel. Donc notre trace est
So our
partout.
traces are everywhere in the world. It is our history of the world. It's humanity's history. It's not as a particular memory. It is the memory of a history and of events that have involved everybody. Look, there are 3 continents when you look at the triangular model.
Je voudrais vous inviter à faire œuvre autobiographique dans un certain sens. Je l'ai dit dans mon introduction.
As I said in the introduction, and my colleague Vicky also mentioned this, that you're born in French Guiana, a region close to Brazil. You are French, of course, but in a certain way, we can also say that you are American, which is this continent where there's the United States, and there were revolutions, the American Revolution that we've been talking about for quite some time, but let's not forget the Haitian or the Bolivian Revolution. So the question is, your birth in French Guiana, this identity that you have and linked to America, what did it teach you, and how it has enabled you to lead the battle that you then end up leading on the French territory? So it's a paradox, but I needed to do quite a bit of research to understand this history, because this history of our territory was not taught to us. I learned a basic history, and we know that education is a fatal weapon to alienate the elite of those territories that were colonized. So to disfigure history, culture, languages, all of the heritage is all part of the colonial project for domination. And authors have written quite a bit on that, Albert Memmi and many others. And other poets and novelists as well have written about that. So education was not present. Things have changed quite a bit now, but there have been some breakthroughs When I was at school, we led to certain protests so that we can ensure that there is literature teaching African American and African literature taught. It was a huge victory when I was in first year of university. But looking at the continent where I was born, I only discovered it because I wanted to. I read on authors Brazilian ones, the Colombians, Chileans, the Argentinians, and I wanted to learn about them. I wanted to understand more. And when I was at high school, we understood civil rights, and this was in the 60s, at the end of the 60s, and we were sensitive to this fight for civic rights. And this is also education. This is a way for us to understand relationships and understand history. So the history of Haiti and the what happened there, this imposed slavery on the colony. Well, that history, I discovered it through my readings and the history of Bolivar. And when I read on him, well, that he was a dictator, well, and his alliances with all of the other all of the other people, well, that story, I discovered it because I decided to read. I decided to dig into literature and poetry as well. So Haiti's history. Now we know that France didn't want to accept Haiti's independence, and when the entire world was looking at the American, what was happening in the States, and that is a very interesting situation. It's interesting to understand that history because this is about at the same time what happened in Haiti and the 13 colonies were about in the States were about the same time at the resurrection. So when the United States were getting rid of the British colonizer, everyone applauded that. And then in Haiti, when the slaves decided to get rid of France, independent nations supported France and to strangle Haiti. So there you have a world that was quite discriminatory and clearly racist. That world does exist. So obviously I was on this continent. I understood this history because I decided to read. I wanted to understand, and I did. And undoubtedly this has fed my sense of my understanding of history, my ability as well to ask questions behind images, behind cliches, behind a stigma. And Césaire, for example, and many other authors have written about this. But I decided to look behind all of these cliches and to look at what were the events that occurred and what were the ambitions and goals. And what was my association with these battles, because my life has been about a battle. I decided that I want to respect ideals, that I choose certain values, and I want to make them come to be. And I try to understand my association with these events. And there's a very important thing with South America. In South America, there's also the opportunity to ask questions on stereotypes. In other parts of the world, oftentimes taking power from militaries are dictatorships, oftentimes authoritarian regimes. In South America, either you have Patouton, who is a soldier, and Colonel Guedres in Guadeloupe fought and died. He fought against slavery, and he was in the army. So there are certain situations where young military, the young soldiers, use power to reinforce rights and freedom. In Africa, there's a certain expression, there's a certain example of a person who took power in order to instaure democracy, freedom, and freedom in Burkina Faso. So South America, well, there was a situation where there was a destabilization and forced me, for example, to ask questions that most people take into that take for granted. So we have about half an hour left, and I'd like us to give us the opportunity for students and participants to ask questions and contribute to this discussion. Let's begin first with the students who have helped me all along the past few days to organize this conference. And to begin, I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Cassie Drodge. Ms. Drodge, if you have a question to ask the minister, go ahead.
Hello, Ms. Taubira. My name is Cassie, and I am a second-year graduate student in the School of Sociological and Anthropological Studies at the University of Ottawa. Firstly, I would like to say thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with me and the other attendees, as well as say that it is a privilege and a pleasure to meet you virtually. Secondly, I would like to ask if you can enlighten us, per se, on your idea of reconciliation. So thank you so much for that, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Cassie, thank you very much for your question. And I really liked your smile. I loved your question as well. So reconciliation, well, this embarrasses me a little bit. And because reconciliation, who? Given that I want us to look at this, that slave trade is the history of those who have been subject to these things. They were not only victims, they were active people. These people were human subjects, and they also lived, though, as humans, and they continued to love, and they were able to also protect themselves from their own love, because during the slave trade, families were separated, and children were sold without thinking about their parents. They would sell the father without thinking about the family at all. So there are literature. Margaret Garner, for example, wrote about this. And she wrote about the history of a woman who left a plantation and was caught and then chose to kill her own daughter so that her daughter would not be raised in or on the plantation. And Toni Morrison also wrote about this.
It's almost like a melody, so to say. This is a melody of a very horrendous story, but it is a story of such a great violence that was brought against one from a love standpoint. So we don't leave the world alone. By leaving the world in peace is recognizing that it's part of history and it's only part of some who are of color, who bear the scars of their past and of their slave ancestors. So they sometimes can cry together and express some emotion on a stage, and then afterwards go back to their darkness. So I think that is something that is not acceptable, and the new generations are doing the work that they need to do, and they've done it through progressively. Some have fought to only acknowledge and have a date of recognition, and others have fought differently. So every generation, because of that, every generation has dealt with the progressive steps. Now we are at a step that is more comprehensive. So it is in order. So sometimes the more youthful generation doesn't take into consideration takes into consideration all of the aspects of the past and doesn't allow anybody to reduce one to nothingness. They don't allow anyone to tell them, oh, poor
et on va
you,
te
we're
donner
going to give you
une
a
petite
little treat
gratification et
there,
c'est terminé.
and it's done.
Non, donc
No,
pour
they
moi,
don't take
la
that for granted.
réconciliation,
For me, reconciliation,
si j'y mets des guillemets, je veux
if I
bien
want
retenir
to
le
quote
concept,
something,
à condition de dire
I
qu'il
would
s'agit en
like to
fait
say
d'accepter
that
de
it is
porter ensemble
accepting to bear
cette histoire
together
et ses
this
conséquences.
history and its
Ces injustices
consequences,
et ses conséquences.
injustices and its
Accepter de les porter
consequences,
ensemble.
accepting
Il n'y
to
a que ça qui
bear them
puisse
together
rétablir de la
and to
fluidité, puis de la
establish some
reconnaissance mutuelle, c'est-à-dire
mutual
non pas se
acknowledgement,
reconnaître
not
en
only
tant
to
que bienfaiteur ou victime,
recognize
mais se
victims
reconnaître
and
mutuellement en tant
doers of
qu'appartenant
good,
à
but
l'espèce
to
humaine. Se
recognize
reconnaître mutuellement,
each other as
c'est-à-dire
part of the
ontologiquement,
human history and human
nous
species.
appartenons à cette même espèce
Together we
humaine.
belong to the
Mais
same
voilà, donc moi
human
je voudrais
species.
vous
So
décharger
I
de
would
ça.
like to just get
Ne
rid you
refaites
of this.
pas
Don't
en mieux le
try to
boulot que
make
les générations
better the
précédentes
work
ont
of
fait.
previous generations.
Faites votre
Do your
part. Votre
part
part, c'est d'être pleinement
and
au monde.
to be
D'être pleinement au monde.
fully
De pas porter le
present
fardeau.
and not
Vous ne
to
pouvez pas porter
bear
le fardeau des
this
criminels. C'est pas possible.
this
C'est pas possible. Nous avons longtemps porté le fardeau
to
des
bear
larmes.
this
Aujourd'hui, il
burden.
est hors de question que vous portiez le fardeau des criminels.
So
Donc, ça n'est
don't
pas
wear
possible.
the
Vous
burden
devez
of
être
criminals. You
pleinement au
have to
monde.
be
Et
fully
pleinement au monde,
present
c'est
and
vivre, c'est penser
live
le monde,
fully,
c'est accéder au pouvoir,
ex-
c'est décider
to
d'avoir une
go
vraie influence sur le
take
monde,
power
c'est décider que,
and
voilà, vous
decide
voulez
what's
agir dans tel
best
domaine, que
for the
ce soit
world
dans
right now, in the now,
bouleversement
in the
climatique,
present.
que
For
ce soit
example,
dans la
on
fraternité
climate
migrante,
issues,
que ce soit dans l'accueil des
on
personnes qui sont
welcoming
dans l'errance sur la planète,
different people
parce
from
que
from
les
all
guerres
walks
les
of
organisent la
life who've
famine,
lived
ou même
through
juste justement le
domestic
climat font que
violence.
ces personnes mettent un pied devant l'autre et vont chercher d'autres pays où
And
ça se
for
peut gagner,
example,
que ce soit
immigrants as
ça
well,
ça
by
se peut gagner
welcoming
vite.
them too.
Donc voilà, c'est ça, et
So
vous dire rien ne vous est interdit. Vous
nothing
voulez
is
accéder au
impossible.
pouvoir chez vous, dans
You
votre
can go
pays,
take power in
battez-vous
your
pour accéder
country,
au
fight
pouvoir.
to
Vous voulez accéder à
to
des
get to power,
responsabilités
take
internationales, battez-vous
responsibility
pour
and
accéder à ces
international
responsabilités internationales.
responsibility
Mais
to
ne
take
demandez, il n'y a
action.
personne qui soit plus légitime que
There is
vous
no one
sur la
else more
planète, et
legitimate
par
than
conséquent,
you
il n'y a
in the
personne à qui
world,
vous deviez
and you
demander
don't need to explain
gentiment,
yourself
est-ce
to
que tu veux
anyone
bien te réconcilier avec
nicely
moi?
and ask
Est-ce que
them,
tu veux
would
bien
you like to
reconnaître ma
reconcile
souffrance,
and
mes douleurs, mes
acknowledge
mal-être et mes droits?
my
Et mes
rights,
droits.
my
Il n'y a personne
pain and
qui
my
ait cette
sorrow?
ascendance sur vous. Donc,
So
pensez-vous
think
comme
about it.
étant
Think about
partie
yourself
prenante
as
entière
being
du
part
monde
of the
auquel vous
world
appartenez.
in which you live.
Je voudrais passer la
I would
parole
like
à
to
mademoiselle
give the
Alexandra
floor to
Carnassus, qui est aussi
Alexandra
étudiante à
Carnassus,
l'Université
who is
d'Ottawa,
also a student from the University of
pour qu'elle
Ottawa,
puisse
so that she can
poser une
ask
question
you a question.
à madame Taubira. Alexandra.
Hello, thanks for your presentation. It's been fantastic to hear from you and to hear what you have to
Hello,
say.
thank you for your presentation.
I have been really interested in the way you talk about recognition of differences.
I'm interested in about how you speak about recognizing differences rather than similarities. And I'm interested about how does recognition of differences allow us to think differently about how we interact with each other and how it allows us to move in the direction of racial and social justice. So could you touch on that? Thank you again.
Merci beaucoup,
So thank you so much, Alexandra. Thank you for your kind words and for this question.
Parce qu'en fait, je
In
vois
fact,
que
I do
la
see
notion
that
de
the
justice
notion of
sociale
social
vous
justice
avez
does
été
come back quite
le
a
premier
bit.
à l'utiliser,
It's quite recurring.
professeur, et je
First,
ne m'y
Professor,
suis
you've
encore
used it,
arrêtée.
and
Donc, merci
thank you so
Alexandra.
much, Alexandra,
Et
for
puis,
asking your question.
ça
So,
peut-être dégager les questions suivantes de cette
so maybe
notion
we
qui
can
sont
touch
importantes
upon
pour vous,
a little bit
parce
of a
que
different topic
voilà,
than
moi je
social
pense
distance.
qu'on
I
est
know this is
génération
something that is very
de
important to you.
générosité.
Your
Il
generation
y a
is
des
a
extrêmes
generation
parmi
of
vous, il y a
generosity.
pas d'égoïsme parmi vous,
This doesn't
il y a des
mean
très
that
honnêtes
there's
parmi
no
vous. Ça ne veut pas dire ça. Ça veut
selfishness,
dire qu'en
but it
tendancieux,
means that
votre
generally your
génération est plutôt
generation is
portée à la
rather marked
générosité, à la découverte de
by
l'autre, à la
discovering the other
curiosité. Voilà, votre
curiosity
génération est
and
plutôt portée
and
sur ça.
generosity.
Et donc, je ne suis pas
So
étonnée
I'm
que la
not
question de la justice
quite
sociale
astonished
soit
that
une
the
question
issue
aussi
of social
prégnante.
justice
Je
is
vais m'y
so
arrêter.
prominent.
D'abord, sur la question de
First,
la
on
différence,
the issue of
une phrase à mi
differences, once again,
c'est la
it is
réalité
the
du monde
reality
et
of
de
the world
l'espèce
and in
humaine.
the human species.
Et
That's
votre
the
génération
difference. And your
peut,
generation, I
j'espère,
hope,
peut l'imposer comme
will
vision du monde.
impose
Que
it
nous
upon
sommes
the world.
divers, nous
The
sommes
fact that we
différents,
are
et que
different,
c'est
we are
une chance
diverse, and
inouïe.
we are so
C'est une
lucky
chance inouïe de ne pas
to
tous
be
être les
able
mêmes, de ne pas
to
se
be
ressembler
different and
tous, de ne
not look
pas...
alike
Voilà.
and have
C'est
different
une chance
backgrounds. This
inouïe.
is a great
Donc,
opportunity.
la différence,
So
c'est juste
difference is just the fact that humanity would not have survived without difference. Furthermore, there are differences. The interest of difference is actually the issue of equality. So difference in daily life is interesting because my neighbor is different than I am, and it sparks my interest, piques my curiosity to know more about where they're from, and so it is knowledge that I'd like to obtain. But the difference is when you relate it to social justice, when your preoccupations touch upon inequalities. So inequalities create injustices in society, and the issue of difference in society is actually the issue of equality of rights in society. And the problem of differences is that differences make it such as in our society today, in great democracies of today, and in this society, there are biases and processes that produce and reproduce inequalities. For example, people that look different simply by appearance don't have access to housing, to mobility, to move around, meaning that they're stuck in certain parts of the territory and cannot move around. And people who live with these biases that are included in society, and this is a trace that exists in a society that is compartmentalized and creates discrimination. And the issue of difference brings back the idea of equality and the fight for equal rights. So all difference needs to be acknowledged as a human fact and a social issue, but it cannot be a pretext for discrimination. So regardless of your religion, looks, ability, who you love, or regardless of all other differences, a difference is a fact and it cannot be a pretext for discrimination. So recognizing discrimination, it allows us to fight for more equal societies, and as a plural society accepts the fact that we are individually different, but we can work together by having the same rights. So I just noticed that time flies. Sorry, Professor, it's completely my fault. But that's okay, we will make it. So we have some questions of our students from Benin, and they're quite similar. So what I would like to do now is that our Benin students, Arnaud, Christelle, and Xavier, would you be able to consequently ask your questions and then allow Ms. Taubira to answer all of your questions, and then we will take another question that is different, and then I will ask Karine Sanchez. So Armand, the floor is yours. Thank you, Professor, for the opportunity they were allowing me to be here. Thank you, Ms. Taubira. And your decision and your law will forever be engraved in our history. So Africans practiced the slavery before the arrival of Europeans and Arabs and must be condemned, says Benini's Professor Felix Iroko. The Arabs have practiced slavery from the 7th century to the 19th century with about 15 million African victims. So why did the Taubira law exclude the condemnation of sub-Saharan slavery? Christelle da Silva, now you can also ask your question. She is also a student of economic studies in Benin. Would you like to share your question? Thank you, Professor Gay. Thank you, Ms. Minister, for your presentation. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Christina da Silva, student of African Economic Studies in Benin. Are there sanctions that could be considered, and what reparations can be expected from the recognition of slavery trade as a crime against humanity? Thank you so much.
Excellent.
Excellent.
Monsieur Xavier
Xavier Agbeto, who is also a student of African Economic Studies in Benin, would you also like to share a question with the public, please? Sorry, I will use the screen from Armand. So what I was saying earlier, it's a pleasure for us to attend this conference and to have the opportunity to share ideas with Madame Taubira. So my question is the following. Given the role played by some Benin Brazilian families in the Atlantic trade, where Benin was one of the focal points of this trade, do you think that a work of memory is necessary for our African societies? Thank you so much. So now we will give the floor to Ms. Taubira to answer these three questions, and afterwards we will ask one more question by Karine, and then we will look for questions in the audience. Ms. Taubira, I can allow you 8 minutes to discuss.
Très aimable, mais vous avez beaucoup tardé à jouer l'ascenseur, professeur.
Thank you so much.
J'en conviens volontiers, c'est que voilà, je mets toujours beaucoup trop d'ardeur.
Great, thank you. Oftentimes I am very energetic when I answer, so that's why it takes a lot of time. So Armand's question, can you just remind me what Armand's first name was? His name was Armand Degla, or it was Xavier Agbeto? No, the young woman. It was Christelle. Christelle de Silva. Great, thank you. Because I didn't hear her name properly. So you were right that these are questions that are related. So Armand talked about the Arab slaves, or slaves, Arabs practice slaves, and we also talked about this in African societies. So Armand, it is a fact is that this occurred and slavery existed in African societies, just as it existed in Rome and on the European continent and elsewhere. This does not take away at all, even if it was said millions of years before. I'll say the domination of one human being over another one is unacceptable. I'm just going to be very clear with that. So I'm not going to. So yes, there was slavery in Africa, and the pretext used oftentimes, the response that is given in Europe, well, people who refuse to listen to this history and to acknowledge that it was a crime, and then acknowledge that it has consequences. So I am surprised that you're asking this question in that way, not because you're asking this question because it is a historic fact, but the fact that you're asking it in this manner, which is why this act in 2001 only deals with certain slavery. I'm a parliamentarian at the French National Assembly. So I had a bill that then became an act so that French institutions would recognize the crime against humanity that was perpetrated by monarchies, French and European ones. There are people in the past and people today who are involved in this crime. So if I simply wanted to put together something that was symbolic or theoretical, then I could have included everybody.
Puisque je le conteste, puisque je trouve que Spartacus a eu raison de se battre, que Spartacus a eu raison de se révolter, que Spartacus est une des grandes lumières qui, moi, m'a éclairé. Et grande lumière, non seulement en
So we know that the battles that occurred where people fought against slavery, well,
qu'au moment
were
où
great because
lui se retrouvait acculé à
at
commettre
one
ce
point
crime pour la libération, pour la
people
liberté
were ready
des
to
esclaves qu'il avait suivis,
uh,
il a refusé de se
face
compromettre
crime
dans des crimes de pouvoir.
in order to
Donc
liberate people.
voilà, moi je peux faire
So
comme
I
tout le monde et
could
vous faire une théorie qui est générale
put
et
together a
remonter à
theoretical
Spartacus et en trouver d'autres.
law, and that would
Je
include
suis députée à
Spartacus.
l'Assemblée nationale
But look, I
française.
am at the
J'interpelle
National
les institutions
Assembly in
républicaines
French, so I
françaises. Je les interpelle sur ce
am
qu'elles peuvent dire et
hoping that
réparer.
these institutions in
Et
France
grâce à
can
ce qu'elles
do and repair,
agissent.
and for them to
Et je
take
vous informe,
action.
Armand, d'ailleurs,
And
dans la
Armand, I
même
will tell
année
you that in the
2001,
same year,
au sein du
2001,
à Durban, en Afrique du Sud,
in
le
South
sommet
Africa,
de l'Organisation des
at the
Nations
United
Unies,
Nations
où il est
Summit,
question
where
de reconnaître l'esclavage, la traite négrière
this
esclave
was
comme
brought
crime
up,
contre l'humanité,
the
et de
question
traiter
of
de la question de la
slavery as
réparation
a crime against
qu'a
humanity,
soulevé tout à l'heure
and
Christine
the
sur
question
laquelle
of
je vais revenir.
reparation was also
Donc,
raised.
l'esclavage, il y a
So slavery,
suffisamment de femmes et d'hommes
there are
politiques africains et
political
africains,
women and
suffisamment
men,
d'intellectuels
there
africains et
are
africaines,
African
suffisamment
intellectuals,
d'artistes africains et africains,
African
suffisamment de militantes
artists,
et de militants
and African
africains
activists
et africains capables de
who
dire,
are
voilà, il y avait de
able
l'esclavage,
to say that
voilà,
yes,
voilà,
slavery
ce qu'on devait
occurred,
faire,
this is what we should
etc.
do, and this is what
Je vais vous dire une chose
should
simple,
happen. Now,
c'est
here's a
que
simple thing.
il y a un texte de
Leonardo
qui est un
Mianojo
Congolais franco-camerounaise,
is a
un texte de
French Cameroonian
Miano qui dit quelque chose d'absolument essentiel.
writer who
Elle
wrote
dit
something
souvent
that is
les
essential.
Européens
Oftentimes,
reprochent
Europeans
aux Africains
reproach
d'avoir
Africans
contribué à la
to
traite
have
négrière et à
contributed
l'esclavage.
to slave trade.
Ils accusent les
They
Européens
accuse
d'eux-mêmes
Europeans that they
parce qu'ils
themselves
ils ont vendu leurs frères.
were
L'endroit
responsible.
Miano dit quelque
That
chose
Imiano
d'essentiel.
says something that is
Elle dit,
essential. She
mais à
says,
cette
at
période-là,
that time,
l'Afrique, ça n'était pas
Africa
l'Afrique
wasn't
panafricaine.
Africa as we know it.
Les villages étaient en guerre les uns contre
Villages
les
were
autres,
in war
mais on le
one against another, and just like in
étaient en
Europe,
affrontement les uns contre les autres,
and they were against many
les
people were against
peuples
each other.
vaincus étaient réduits en esclavage, etc.
People were reduced to
Donc le
slavery.
prétexte qui
So the
consiste à dire
pretext
que des Africains ont
shows that
participé à la
Africans did
traite
participate in the
transatlantique,
transatlantic slave
dont
trade,
ils sont
and
aussi
therefore
coupables
they're
que les
also
Européens,
guilty as much as
c'est un délit
Europeans. Well, look,
avéré. Ceci étant,
that is
ça n'absout
does
pas
not
ceux qui effectivement ont
absolve
contribué.
those who have
Ça
contributed,
n'absout pas ceux qui ont contribué. Parce qu'il y en a qui ont
because there are
résisté.
people who
Le
have
fait qu'il y en a
resisted,
qui aient
and these
résisté
people who have resisted
interdit d'absoudre ceux qui ont
does not
contribué.
absolve those
Des
who
personnes
have
comme la reine
contributed.
Nzinga,
People like
au
Nzinga,
Pandango, qui est devenu l'Angola après.
who, and then where
Des personnes,
in
voilà,
Angola,
il y a des personnes qui ont
there are
résisté.
people who have resisted.
Sundiata Keita, et ça c'est pour la traite transsaharienne.
And there's a trans-Saharan slave trade that occurred as well. Suanta Tekea in 1222 proclaimed a charter where that deals with slavery. And there are other events and people who were captured. There's like a particular person in Timbuktu, born in Morocco, who then stood up against slavery. Look, there are people who have fought in that time. So yes, I understand that you're a student, but we must be against all oppression, all domination, anything that forces anyone or treats people like objects. And there is a slave trade that is occurring now, and this needs to be condemned. Now, I know I've passed my 8 minutes here, but when it comes to ideals, let's not mix up things in that manner. If the world is the way it is, look, the trans-Saharan slave trade needs to be condemned. Slavery that was practiced in villages also needs to be condemned. And the transatlantic slave trade, the same, which was organized through tools, capitalism tools, needs to be condemned. And through this triangular trade led to an accumulation of capital and also changes the societies. Now, when it comes to domination, everything is the same thing. It is all unacceptable. When we look at historic events, it is we should not confuse things. Now, I know I didn't talk about reparation,
Alors, j'espère que Xavier a entendu
but I
aussi,
hope
parce que
that
dire les familles
this
brésiliennes, etc.,
answer your questions.
Xavier, pendant la
Xavier,
colonisation, l'esclavage,
during
le
slave
Portugal
trade, Portugal
était la métropole de domination
was
au
the point of
Brésil.
domination
Donc, on est
over
précis dans les
Brazil.
termes et on sait de quoi on parle. On précise les époques, etc. Ça ne veut pas dire le
This
Brésil
doesn't mean
est un
that
pays qui est
Brazil
très problématique.
is
C'est un pays très
not
problématique. C'est un
problematic.
pays où d'ailleurs le Movimento Negro se
It is
bat
a
depuis
country
des
where the
dizaines
Movimento Negro has
d'années
been
pour
fighting
faire
for years in
reconnaître
order
l'importance du
to
patrimoine
recognize the
afro-brésilien et
Afro-Brazilian
l'égalité
heritage
des droits
and
pour
equality
les
of rights for
afro-descendants, pour les Brésiliens
African
afro-descendants. La
descendants
réparation
in Brazil.
d'un mot, c'est compliqué.
Reparation is very complicated, and
D'accord, donc on va passer à la
actually, let's go
question
to the next
de
question
Mademoiselle Karine
and move to
Je vais
Karine
répondre à notre question
Cohen
parce que
Sanchez.
ne pas y répondre du coup.
Je vais vous prier de répondre en
And I'm
2
asking you if you
minutes
could please
pour que ça
answer in
fasse
2 or 3 minutes so that
clore
we can then
l'émission
conclude
avec
our
Karine.
conference. Karine.
Si vous permettez, veuillez partager votre
Karine, go ahead with your
avec
question.
le public.
Bonjour, comment allez-vous?
Hi, how are things going?
Je voulais prendre l'opportunité
I
de
want to
vous
take this
remercier
opportunity to thank you as well for being here today.
Ma question est en anglais.
My question is in English.
Je voulais vous demander, how do you
So,
function in a society
how do you
where
function in a society where citizenship and the color of your skin are not linked?
D'abord, il ne faut pas s'adapter, Karine.
So,
Il faut
firstly,
pas s'adapter,
you don't
il
have
faut
to
se
adapt,
battre, parce que c'est
Karine. You have
inadmissible.
to fight.
Parce que c'est
It is
inadmissible.
unacceptable.
Donc, il faut se battre
You have to
par tous les
simply, you have to
moyens,
fight by all
par des
means,
poèmes,
through
par des réunions,
poetry,
par des
through meetings,
sit-ins,
through
par des manifestations, par des
protests,
luttes associatives, par
through
des luttes syndicales, par des
associative
luttes étudiantes, par des luttes
battles,
politiques,
political
par des luttes
battles,
électorales.
electoral
Il faut se
battles. You
battre,
have to
il ne faut pas s'en
fight.
accommoder, il ne faut pas
You
l'accepter.
simply can't
Voilà,
accept that.
c'est un déni
It is
d'humanité, c'est un déni
denigration of
de
humanity,
citoyenneté,
of citizenship,
comme vous dites vous-même. Donc,
as you say
voilà,
yourself.
on ne doit pas
So
s'adapter à
you don't
ça,
adapt to
on ne doit
that.
pas s'en accommoder, ni pour
You
soi,
don't
ni pour
accommodate, not to, for yourself or
parce
for
que si on
others.
s'habitue aux
Because if we get
injustices
used to
qui sont
injustices
infligées à d'autres,
inflicted
on
on other
légitime
people, then
les
we
injustices
legitimize
qu'on
these
subit parfois
injustices
ou qu'on risque de subir dans
that we
l'avenir.
may face in the
Donc, il ne
future.
faut pas
So
l'accepter.
simply
Voilà,
don't
c'est juste qu'il ne
accept
faut pas
it. You
l'accepter.
can't accept it.
Alors après, on se bat avec les armes qu'on a, comme on veut.
So
Ça
you
peut être
fight
en
in
chanson, ça
whatever
peut être
which way,
vraiment avec
through
les armes qu'on a,
songs,
mais on se bat.
but you have to fight.
J'ai quand même le temps en 2
I
minutes
do
de
have,
répondre sur la réparation.
I'm going to answer
Parce qu'on n'a pas
the question on reparation if I can.
oui, 2 phrases.
2
On n'a
sentences.
pas le droit
We have no
d'éliminer
right
le
to
sujet de la
eliminate
réparation.
the
Je
subject
pense
of
2 grandes
reparation.
choses.
There are
J'ai
2
écrit
things,
beaucoup
and
de
I've written
choses sur
quite
la
a bit on
réparation.
reparation.
Je pense 2
But here are
grandes
2
choses. La
things.
première
First
chose,
thing,
c'est que le crime est irréparable.
the crime is
Et que donc
irreparable.
personne ne peut venir
So
dire
no
on
one
va réparer.
can say, well, look, how can we repair
Et
this
que
crime?
la réparation possible à ce
Possible
moment-là,
reparation
elle a été faite par les
has been
esclaves
done by the
eux-mêmes.
slaves themselves.
C'est-à-dire le fait qu'ils n'aient jamais renoncé
The
à leur
fact that they
humanité.
never
Ils ont
renounced
fait en sorte
their humanity
qu'ils n'ont pas donné prise
and they
au
didn't
fait que des personnes
let
afro de peau noire et qu'elles vivent sur le continent africain ne sont pas des êtres humains. Donc ça, elles ont réparé
they were
cette
able
espèce
to
de
reach
crime
reparation
absolu de
for this
dénégation
crime
de l'humanité. Mais il y a d'autres
on
réparations,
humanity, but there are other
notamment
reparations
par tout le patrimoine
by the
culturel et
entire
artistique
cultural and
dont je
artistic
parlais, qui nous
heritage
a
that I was
été
talking to you
légué
about
par toutes
that
ces
was
générations.
handed down to us
Et
through
puis,
all of
il
the
y a des
generations. And
réparations
then there
à
are
faire
also
parce qu'il y a
reparations that
toute
need
une
to be
série
done because there are
d'injustices qui ont
injustices
été
that
instaurées à la
were
sortie des
that
systèmes
came out
esclavagistes.
after the slave
C'est-à-dire
trade.
qu'il y a des endroits où on a indemnisé
So
les
people were
esclaves, on les
compensated,
a
some masters were
indemnisés
compensated
contre la perte de
because
leurs
of the loss
esclaves,
of their
alors qu'on n'a pas
slaves,
indemnisé
and
les
yet the
esclaves
slaves were
contre
not
les
compensated
générations
because of
et
all of
les
the
dizaines et centaines
generations
d'années
and
de travail gratuit. Donc,
of free
il y a
work.
le mode de sortie du système esclavagiste a fait qu'on
So after
a
the slave trade,
ajouté
we have there
des
has been an
injustices qui
added
perdurent aujourd'hui
injustices
encore,
that
c'est-à-dire qu'on voit
we
bien
see
que
today.
celles et ceux qui viennent plus
People
directement
who
des
directly
personnes qui ont
come
été
from
mises en
people who were
esclavage
slaves
ont plus difficilement
have
accès à l'éducation,
harder
à
or
la
have less
santé,
education
aux
or has less access
responsabilités,
to
aux métiers
education,
prestigieux, etc. Et ça, il faut se
and
décider à le réparer.
this needs to be repaired.
Eh bien, merci beaucoup.
Great, thank you very much, Ms. Minister. This has been very challenging to get all this information in the hour and a half.
Et je n'en suis même pas confuse.
C'est pas très grave. Ce que je vais faire donc sans tarder, c'est
Without further ado,
pas la possibilité
unfortunately, we don't have the opportunity to ask you more questions, but I'd like to give the floor over to Victoria Bahram again, the Dean, and then I will take a couple seconds to close this session.
Donc,
Vicky,
je voudrais
Victoria, rather.
vraiment, au nom de la faculté
On
et
behalf
de
of the faculty and on behalf of the University of Ottawa,
vous
I'd like
remercier,
to
Madame
thank
le
you, Ms.
ministre,
Taubira,
pour ce discours
for
éloquent,
your
passionné
passionate,
et
eloquent
surtout donc interpellant.
words,
C'était un grand plaisir.
striking words. It was
Et
a
je
great
voudrais
pleasure.
également
I would like to
remercier mon
also thank
collègue
my
Abdoulaye Gay.
colleague Abdoulaye
Je
Gay.
voudrais remercier tous
I'd like
les
to thank all
étudiants
students
qui, donc ici au Canada, mais aussi
here in Canada
au
and all
Bénin,
those in Benin
pour votre travail, pour la préparation des
for
questions
having
qui nous
prepared
ont
these
tous
questions
intéressés. Et
that
je
we
remercie
were all interested in.
le
And
public
I'd like to
pour
thank
votre
the greater public for
participation,
your participation.
sans oublier
And
bien
let's not
non
forget
plus l'équipe en
the
arrière-plan, notre équipe
team
de
behind
communication,
the
Kelly
scenes,
Ashcroft,
communication
Frédéric,
teams, Kelly
l'équipe
Ashcroft,
ABLA
Abla's
et
team,
notre service
and to the
d'interprétation aujourd'hui.
interpreters.
C'était fantastique de l'avoir dans
It
les
was
deux
great to be
langues.
able to offer this
Et
in
puis
both
l'équipe
languages. And thank you very much
donc
to
Guerre,
Pierre's
etc.
team.
Sans vous autres,
Without
on
you,
n'aurait
we would
jamais
not
pu
have been
avoir
able
un
to
après-midi si instructif.
have this session. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous de m'avoir accueilli.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Merci beaucoup, Vicky. Je vais donc sans tarder aussi profiter
I'd
de
like to take this
l'occasion
opportunity as
pour
well to
remercier
thank
Madame
Ms.
Christiane
Christiane
Taubira. Je vous avais dit que
Taubira.
Madame Taubira est une personnalité singulière.
Madame
Son
Taubira is
personnalité,
unique.
c'est une personnalité qui ne laisse personne indifférent.
And
Et le contenu des échanges que nous
based
avons
on the
aujourd'hui
exchanges that we've
avec
had today,
elle
this
et avec
afternoon,
elle montre à quel
we
point, en
see
fait, j'avais raison.
how
Donc, encore une fois,
she
Madame
is very
Taubira,
unique.
merci
Thank you very
infiniment.
much, Ms.
Je remercie
Taubira.
aussi tous les
I'd like to thank
étudiants
all
qui ont
students who
participé
have
à
participated
la réalisation
in
de cet événement.
this
Et je
event.
remercie aussi
And I'd like to also
l'équipe
thank
menée par Emeric.
Emeric's
Sans cette
team.
équipe aussi, nous aurions peut-être connu beaucoup plus de défis. Je vous donne très rapidement la parole.
So,
Un mot de
if you'd like to say
clôture.
some final words, Ms. Taubira, go ahead.
Juste, moi, je me rends compte que je suis incorrigible et que
Well,
contrairement aux personnes normales,
unlike
l'âge n'apporte pas chez moi la
normal
sagesse.
people,
Donc, voilà,
look,
si
I'm very
vous sentez
particular.
un peu trop de
So
ferveur
maybe I was
dans mes
very
réponses, elles sont toujours
energetic in my
nécessaires, vraiment.
responses, and
J'espère
they are
que
always
les
very long. I
étudiants
hope
qui
that
n'auront
these
pas été
students were
ennuyés
not
et
bored,
que je leur ai surtout donné
and I hope
envie
that I
de
gave them the
creuser, de
desire to
s'interroger, de ne rien
dig
tenir pour
deeper,
acquis, ni
to
le
not
monde
take
que nous leur
anything for
laissons,
granted.
que nous leur, nous leur laissons même pas, hein, ni le monde dans lequel ils grandissent et que nous avons un peu maltraité, ni les mots que nous utilisons pour
And
décrire
hopefully
le monde, ni les rapports
that
entre les
words,
personnes, entre les
relationships,
sociétés, rien n'est définitivement
that
acquis.
nothing
Et leur
is taken
charge
for
est
granted,
d'interroger
and
tout
their
ça, de conserver
job
ce
is to
brillant
ask
de l'être, parce que
questions,
nous n'avons
dig
quand
deep,
même pas tout raté,
because
et
not
de dire
everything is a
d'apporter
failure,
leur part et
and
de
we need to
montrer
bring
qu'ils
our
sont
part
d'y
to
mettre
all
un
of
peu plus de
this,
fraternité, plus
and to ensure that
d'amitié,
there is more friendship, more
plus de beauté
brotherhood, and
aussi,
more beauty
plus
in
de
our work,
compassion
and more
dans ce monde, d'y
compassion
mettre un peu plus, et puis
in this world.
vraiment une denrée, un
It is an
ingrédient
ingredient that is
irremplaçable,
irreplaceable, which
extrêmement
is very
mérité
savory
et
and
vraiment
essential, and
essentiel,
that is
c'est
joy,
la
the
joie,
joy
la
of
joie de vivre.
living.